then the rest.
Education meaning public schools and universities, or education?
All of the above. Yeah. All forms of education, including paid education. In other words, the schools, commercial schools that you pay for to go to. Beyond that, right now, I would say it's pretty uniform. That's largely anecdotal, but I don't see anybody in any sector saying, "Oh, things are are okay right now." So I think it's fairly uniform across the economy, with the exception of healthcare and education. Okay, that's how I would suggest you look at the economy. Probably for most of this year, we'll be in the bottom of that U. The earlier we start to swing up, obviously, the better. But I think the biggest single obstacle, biggest single barrier to that kind of recovery, the recovery is going to be credit. I think most people in small business would tell you that they're still having difficulty getting the kind of credit that they're accustomed to from their own banks. That's credit for inventory, bridge loans, things of that kind, even for small businesses that have good credit. The bankers will tell you a different story, but if you go to the people who are trying to borrow, for the most part you hear that they're having great difficulty getting the kind of credit that they need. If that continues, it's going to be very difficult for small businesses to hire people because they're not going to be able to get the operating cash that they're going to need. So if there were one factor that I would point to that will inhibit the more speedy recovery of the economy on Long Island, it would be that. Okay. It is, again, important to keep perspective. As difficult as this economy and the situation is, keep perspective, keep a historical perspective. Remember that this is fundamentally a strong economy on Long Island and in the country. So keep perspective without minimizing the reality. In other words, we don't want to be Pollyannish about it and say, oh, what's the big deal? It is a big deal. It's a big deal for many people, and certainly all of the people who are affected by unemployment. It's a major deal. But we need to keep some historical perspective as well as business perspective. Understand that we are a consumer economy and the consumers are traumatized. What I mean by that is Long Island in the past, take the recession of around 2000 when there was a dip in the national economy. Long Island's economy really didn't dip. I believe it was only 1 or 2 months that we went into negative job growth during that entire period of time, quite unlike the rest of the region and the rest of the country. And at the time, consumer spending remained very high. And we used to say that Long Island essentially shopped its way out of the recession. And in a sense that, that it makes you smile, but it economically is very real. Because Long Island consumers did not stop spending during that period of time. And that spending, had its ripple effect throughout the broader economy. And that's what got Long Island through that period of time. That has to continue to happen. Consumer spending is still down, as I showed, I think it was 3.4%. Hopefully that will begin to rise back up, and once it does, then that will help generate the kind of cash flow that small businesses need to hire people. We have a very diverse economy and a strong small business base. That was really the result of the recession of the early 1990s. Long Island's economy was very dependent upon aerospace back at that period of time and for the decades before that. And as bad as that experience was, and as disruptive as it was to the economic base of Long Island, it forced Long Island to diversify its economy. Many of the people who were in aerospace went out into other industries, and that helped to diversify the economy. We strengthened other high-tech industries on Long Island. That helped to diversify the economy. So the diversification of the economy ultimately is what puts us in a better position to ride more moderately the sharp ups and downs of the national economy. A small business base allows that also. If you're in a region of the country that is very dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 big businesses that employ thousands of people, and those businesses are forced to take huge layoffs, you can have hundreds or thousands of people lose their jobs in a very short period of time. It's very difficult to reabsorb those people into the economy. But with a small business base, small businesses tend to hold on to their employees longer, and hire new employees back faster in the normal credit market, and they don't let go hundreds of people and thousands of people all at the same time. It's a more gradual process. So diversification and a small business base are very important to Long Island's economy going forward, and will help stabilize the economy and bring it back faster. Those are our strengths, and that's what we have to continue to build upon on Long Island. You've got to keep that in mind. You don't want to go back to the days in which your economy is heavily dependent on one specific industry. Not a healthy thing. You want to maintain diversity, expand diversity, and you want to maintain a strong small business base and help small businesses as much as possible survive and thrive. Now, let's move into some other issues for 2010. The state budget deficit and its effect. I'll explain that. I should say deficits, you'll see when I get to the next slide, because we're not looking at one deficit. Local budgets and tax issues. This is going to be an extremely political year, and that will have an effect on Long Island, what we're able to do. Federal stimulus for small businesses, and I'll touch briefly on federal health insurance reform because it will be such a hot topic of discussion during 2010. But even if it's passed in Congress, it will not take effect until 2014. A lot of people don't know that. I mean, there are people out there I know who don't have health insurance, who believe that if this bill is passed, they're going to get health insurance. They will not get health insurance for 4 years, most of them. And that's something everybody needs to focus on. The health insurance reform legislation that's in Congress would not take effect for 4 years. Let's talk about the state's budget deficit and deficits. The state fiscal year begins in April every year. So when I refer to the 2010-2011 state budget deficit, we're talking about the year that begins in April. Now, the deficit for that fiscal year is estimated at between $8 and $11 billion, depending upon whose estimate you are taking into account. How do they develop an estimate of deficit? It's based upon current spending and current legal commitments. What has the legislature in the past said it's going to do in 2010 and 2011? And what would it cost in 2010, 2011 dollars? And how much money are you projecting is going to come in? So that's a budget process. They have to decide how much money is likely to come in, and usually there's a governor's estimate, an assembly estimate, a Senate estimate, and a controller's estimate. Under the law now, the controller's estimate is the estimate that applies and that the legislature and the governor have to live by. The controller is estimating a deficit between $8 and $10 billion. So that is what the state is going to have to deal with. And today, in Albany, Governor Patterson puts out his proposed executive budget for the fiscal year. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit because that can have very significant fiscal effects on your business and on your personal life. The budget that comes out today and ultimately the budget that's passed in Albany. I'll tell you just parenthetically that if you doubt that the budget that they work on in Albany can have that kind of effect on your personal life, remember that last year, in the middle of the Great Recession, the legislature and the governor approved tax increases totaling $11 billion. And that affected every one of us here in this room. Now, the worst news is that if you project out the deficit for 2 more years, a total of 3 years, they are projecting the total 3-year deficit for the state of New York at about $40 billion. Why is that? Well, because last year, in 2009, the state accepted federal stimulus money, about $10 billion in federal stimulus money, but decided that instead of using that money to replace state spending and keep overall spending where it was, the state increased spending by $11 billion. Now, the federal stimulus money runs out at the end of 2010, 2011. So your spending is up here, supported artificially by the federal stimulus money. 1 year from now, that money is gone, but your spending is still high. And that's why they are projecting a deficit of $40 billion over the next 3 years. $40 billion, even in Albany terms, is real money. To try to deal with a $40 billion deficit is profoundly difficult in terms of Albany politics. Remember that part of that tax increase